Yes, sir. Shall we start, sir?
Yes, sir. I'm ready.
Now the second session of day 3 of Atal FDP on novel materials and their applications being addressed by Dr. Atul Khanna. Dr. Atul Khanna is working as professor at Department of Physics, Guru Nanak Dev University, Amritsar. He earned PhD degree in applied physics from Guru Nanak Dev University, Amritsar, and postdoctoral research at the University of Arkansas, USA. He worked as scientific officer in the Technical Physics and Prototype Engineer Division, BARC Mumbai, where he initiated research in thin film gas sensors. He has published more than 83 research papers in international journals. Dr. Atul Khanna supervised more than 15 PhD students. Professor Khanna has completed 16 major research projects and 4 ongoing projects funded by DST, UGC, DAE, IUAC, CSIR. He has teaching experience more than 10 years. He has honored with the Young Scientist Award in Physics by Indian Science Congress Association, Kolkata, the National Builder Award and the Vocational Excellence Award. Besides a number of conferences presentation, he has also delivered popular talks in inspired camps, schools, colleges, and universities. In this session, Dr. Atul Khanna is going to share and guide us on topic glass and crystalline phosphors for solid state lighting. Over to you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, madam, for my introduction. And I thank all the faculty, staff, the Vice Chancellor of the Maharaja Ranjit Singh Punjab Technical University for this kind invitation. And I'm very thankful in particular to Dr. Satnam Singh, Dr. Jasbir Singh Hundal, and your Vice Chancellor, Professor Sidhu, for an opportunity to present my research work. So I'm going to share my screen. So can you see my presentation?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So we go full screen.
Yes.
So this is the title of my today's lecture or presentation. It is a talk which will highlight the importance of fluorescent materials, and I will be discussing the glass and crystalline fluorescent materials, which can find applications for lighting, for solid state lighting. I am faculty at Guru Nanak Dev University, Amritsar. So this slide shows us the photograph of our campus, a beautiful campus of Guru Nanak Dev University. And we have a very impressive building, which is the Central Library. So can you see this next slide?
Yes,
Yes,
sir. Yeah.
sir.
Okay. So why we need luminescence? I mean, what is the applications of light emitting materials or luminescent materials? So, you know, lighting is something extremely important for us because we have daylight for only 12 hours on the planet Earth. Due to the rotation of the Earth, we have 12 hours day and 12 hours night in any part of the planet. So the luminescent materials, they can find applications as sensors. For example, photodiode can be as a position sensor. So a photodiode is a semiconductor device. So when light falls on a semiconductor, its electronic conductivity enhances, and you see a change in a current. So we can use light as a sensor, and that light has to be generated by some source, like a bulb or a tube light or an incandescent bulb and so on. And then we use LEDs. You know, in our school days, when I was a in school in the younger days, we had incandescent bulbs, which were mostly used for lighting purposes, or the tube lights or the fluorescent bulbs. But nowadays, in our homes and offices, we use solid state devices, which basically consists of LEDs. And then your solar cells, they also use the natural light for the conversion of light into electricity. So luminescent materials are technologically very important materials. There is immense importance for these luminescent materials. So luminescence is of several types. Can you see the next slide?
Yes,
Is
sir.
it going forward? Okay. So luminescence, it comes in a variety of types. So for example, we are having bioluminescence. You are all familiar with the insect known as jugunu, or a firefly that emits light. And if you go to some of the coastal areas where there is ocean or a sea, you will see during the night time, the microorganisms in the ocean, they are emitting this blue light. So that is bioluminescence. Bioluminescence is the light emitted by some insects or by some microorganisms. And basically, like an insect, like a jugunu or a firefly, it emits light because that insect releases some chemical which reacts with the atmospheric oxygen, and it emits light. So some kind of a chemical reaction takes place. So basically, bioluminescence is also what is known as the chemiluminescence. For example, in this picture number 6, you see we mix some chemicals. And when we mix some chemicals, certain chemicals, then some intermediary compounds are formed which are unstable. And those intermediary compounds, they emit light and they decompose into more stable compounds. So that is chemiluminescence. You can see the initial chemicals are colorless, but when the reaction takes place, some unstable compound is formed, which is unstable, and it decomposes by the emission of light. So then there is the example of radioactive luminescence. You know, earlier our watches used to be coated with radium. Radium is an actinide and it emits alpha particles. So some of the radioactive materials like uranium, plutonium, radium, they emit alpha particles, beta particles, and those particles, they can cause scintillations. So you can see the emission of light. Then electroluminescence. It is the light emission by the virtue of passing electrical current. This happens in your incandescent bulb, the tungsten bulb. We are having a coil of tungsten. We apply voltage and the current flows through tungsten, and the tungsten atoms, they get excited. And when they go down to the ground state, they emit light radiation. So that is electroluminescence. Then thermoluminescence. Certain materials, they absorb the radiation, and when you heat them, they radiate light in the visible region or even in the IR region. Then, you know, we use photoluminescence in our road signs. On our roads, we have these markings of phosphorescent materials. During daytime, those materials, they absorb UV light and visible light, and then they begin to emit light of longer wavelengths. And the light emission periods can be several hours, 12 hours, 16 hours. So this is what is known as the afterglow, or what is known as the phosphorescence in a more technical term. So luminescence is of immense importance to us. You are familiar with your currency notes, like this 500 rupee note, and you may have seen that when you visit a bank, sometimes your bank official, he will examine this bank note under UV lamp. They have a special lamp and they place the note. So in the visible light, you don't see any special features. but this is a 500 rupee note, which is seen under a UV lens. It is a UV lamp, and when this note is exposed to ultraviolet radiation, then you begin to see fluorescence. You see green light. So there are special markers. There is a special ink which is used in these currency notes, and they emit light when they are exposed to UV light. UV light is, the short wavelength electromagnetic radiations, which have wavelength from say about 150 nanometer to about 350 nanometers. So that is the UV region. And you can see in this currency note, you can see some fibers, some special fibers are there, and when they are illuminated by ultraviolet radiation, they emit visible light. So this is also a fluorescent. This is also the application of fluorescence. Then we are having these TLD badges, thermoluminescence dosimeter. This is made out of some materials like lithium borate, and when this is used by people who are exposed to X-ray radiation, or who are exposed to gamma radiations or neutron radiation in a reactor, or in a place where X-rays are being used. So we have to monitor how much X-ray dose a person or the operator has received. So those dose limits must be within certain limits defined by ICRP, International Council for Radiation Protection. So this is having some material which absorbs X-ray radiation and nuclear radiation, and when you heat it, it emits visible light. So those visible light photon, they are counted, and from that we can estimate how much dose an operator has received in his workplace. Similarly, this is bioluminescence, and it can be used for cancer treatment. This is showing some fluorescent markers which have been introduced inside a rat, and you can actually determine which are the areas that are being affected by the chemicals which are used for the treatment of cancer in a technique known as the chemotherapy. So these are some of the practical applications. Some of the most important ions or the materials which are useful for light emission applications are the rare earth ions. The rare earth ions are trivalent ions, and we have a whole family of the lanthanides, and some of the common well-known rare earth ions are europium, Eu3+. The most stable state of europium is Eu3+. This is the most stable oxidation state of europium ions. Then erbium, 3+, dysprosium, gadolinium, ytterbium, terbium. So there is a whole series of these rare earth ions. These are also known as the F block elements by the chemists because they have last electrons in the F orbitals, in the 4F orbitals. So this is the electronic structure of europium 3+, erbium 3+, and dysprosium 3+. So basically you have to excite the atom from its ground state, and you can do excitation by using UV light, or by using X-rays, or by using electron beams also. So you have to give energy to the atom or to the ion in this case, and the ion goes from the ground state, which are the 7FJ levels, J is equal to 0 levels, and they go to the higher states, which are the 5D states, and they can come back to the ground state in two ways. They can either emit energy which is not in the electromagnetic region. They can come to the lower states either by undergoing radiative transitions or by undergoing non-radiative transitions. So in the phenomena of luminescence, we are of course interested in radiative transitions. For example, these are some of the transitions shown in this left-hand side figure. 698 nanometer, 650 nanometer, 612 nanometer, 395 nanometer is also possible. And these are the radiative transitions. It is also possible that the europium 3 plus ion, it goes down to the lower levels non-radiatively. So in that case, the energy of the excited state is converted into heat energy in the form of lattice vibrations on the phonons. And we can also use silver nanoparticles, and they can show plasmon resonance peaks, and they can transfer their energy to the excited state of europium ions. So somehow you have to excite the radiating ion, which is the europium ion. Similarly, this is the electronic structure, the energy level diagram for erbium 3 plus ions. And erbium, it can emit green light, so 532 nanometer and 550 nanometers. So these are the various excited states, or which is known as the terms. In spectroscopy, we call these different energy states as the terms, or the energy levels. And similarly, we can have dysprosium 3 plus. This is the energy level diagram for dysprosium 3 plus. So dysprosium can also emit blue light and also yellow and green light. So dysprosium ions, if you introduce them in some lattice or in some glass network, they are very useful for the white light emission. That means for the emission of light, which is having all the colors, blue, green, and so on. So this is a very famous diagram known as the Jablonski diagram, named after a Polish physicist. And it illustrates some of the features of the phenomena of luminescence. And in the Jablonski diagram, this is basically an energy level diagram which illustrates the different electronic energy states of an atom or an ion. And the levels are shown vertically. So when you move vertically upwards, the energy is increasing. And if there are some levels which are at the same horizontal position, this means then their energies are same, but their multiplicity may be different. You know, the multiplicity is determined by the spin of the electron in the different terms. So there can occur a variety of physical mechanisms by which an atom can gain energy and then lose energy. So and each electronic energy state, it has around that electronic energy state the vibrational energy states. So the atom can go from the excited state to its various vibrational energy states through non-radiative transitions. So their phonons will be liberated, they will be emitted, not the phonons. So that will give rise to the emission of heat energy, not the emission of electromagnetic energy. So you can see on the diagram which is shown on the left-hand side, on the right-hand side. So we transfer the atom or an ion by giving it energy. It goes to some of the higher excited state, higher electronic energy states, and that is shown by this blue arrow vertically upwards. Now it can come down in several ways. It can come down along these wriggly lines. You can see these wriggly lines in brown. These wriggly lines, they show that the atom comes to the lower energy state step by step. As you can see, you come down in these small steps. And when this happens, you don't see the emission of light. You see the emission of heat energy. And that energy is released by the excited atom in the form of phonons in the lattice or in the glass network. So if these step-by-step downfall take place, then heat energy is liberated. But if an atom comes from the excited state, this is the first excited state, and it goes down, it makes a jump, a sudden jump, then a photon is emitted. So somehow you have to take the atom to the topmost level, to the upper level, and avoid these step-by-step transitions, because I don't want non-radiative transitions, I want a sudden jump. So when the atom suddenly jumps from the excited state to the lower state, then it emits a photon. So we have to minimize non-radiative transitions, maximize the radiative transitions. And what is the frequency of light or the wavelength of light an atom will emit? That will be determined by its electronic structure. And there are different techniques which are available to us to study the electronic structure of an atom or an ion. For example, UV visible spectroscopy, by photoluminescence spectroscopy, by X-ray photoelectron spectroscopy. So there are many ways by which we can experimentally measure the density of states or the electronic structure of an atom. And we can also do calculations using Abienshaw first principles. We have nowadays software like WASP, which can calculate the electronic structure of a material using density functional theory. So these things are well established, and we can calculate the electronic structure and also experimentally verify it. So some of these transitions are allowed, some are forbidden by the rules of quantum mechanics. And the most general rule is that delta L, that means the change in the orbital angular quantum number, should be plus minus 1, and delta S should be 0. So some of these rules can be violated also. So if those transitions take place, then we say the transitions are forbidden. Otherwise, the transitions are called as allowed. So the probability of the allowed transition is very large. The probability of forbidden transitions is small. So that is why so some of the emission lines are very strong, whereas some of the emission lines are weak. So which lines will be strong, which lines will be weak, that is determined by the selection rules given by quantum mechanics. So in case of photoluminescence, we have two very interesting phenomena: up conversion and down conversion. Up conversion is when you convert a low frequency or a long wavelength photon, two long wavelength photons or two low frequency photons. They give rise to a single photon of shorter wavelength or higher frequency. This is the phenomena of up conversion. So we can convert IR light to visible light. For example, I can convert 980 nanometer photon into 536 nanometer photon by doping your material with erbium ions. And I can also do the reverse thing. I can convert a single photon, which is say blue in color, to two photons. And so we can convert UV visible light to IR light, or we can convert UV light to visible light. So this phenomena is known as down conversion. In down conversion, two photons are involved. In downshifting, of course, there occurs an increase in the frequency of the emitted photon, but only one photon is emitted. So that is known as downshifting. In up conversion, two exciting photons are involved. That means excitation takes place by absorbing two photons of the same frequency or same wavelength. And the wavelength is longer and the wavelength of photon emitted is shorter. So this is up conversion. So in up conversion, two photons, they are absorbed and they give rise to one photon of higher energy. In down conversion, one photon is involved as a exciting photon, and it produces two photons of same frequency and of longer wavelength, but the frequency of the emitted photon is less than the frequency of the incident photon. In downshifting, we have only one emitting photon and one exciting photon. But of course, the frequency of the emitted photon is greater than the frequency of the exciting photon. So I will share with you the luminescent or the light emitting properties of some of the materials that we have prepared in our laboratory at Guru Nanak Dev University. And I will discuss the structure and the properties, mostly focusing on the light emitting properties of the glass materials. You know, glass is a solid, but unlike crystalline materials, the arrangement of atoms or the ions in a solid like glass is random. We cannot define any unit cell for glasses, unlike the crystalline materials, where we have a unit cell which can be monoclinic, tetragonal, orthorhombic, cubic, anything. And we are having a large number of materials which can form glasses. So these materials are the so-called glass forming oxides. And the most common among all these materials is silica, silicon dioxide. You have seen sand. In sand, you see these shining particles. Those shining particles are of silica, silicon dioxide. Then we are having B2O3, boron trioxide, tellurium dioxide. This is also an oxide. Germania, germanium dioxide, vanadium pentoxide, phosphorus pentoxide. These materials, they form glasses very easily. So they are known as the glass formers. For example, your window pane glasses, they are soda lime silicate glasses. That means the composition of those glasses is silicon dioxide, calcium oxide, some amount of sodium oxide is also present, and B2O3 is also present. So I will be discussing the fluorescent properties of glasses based upon tellurium dioxide. It's a special glass forming material. It does not form glasses easily, but when you add sodium oxide, calcium oxide, heavy metal oxides like bismuth oxide or tungsten oxide or copper oxide to tellurium dioxide, it forms glasses very easily, and its melting point is also low. Melting temperature of telluride glasses based on tellurium dioxide is about 900 degrees Celsius, 800 to 900 degrees Celsius. So briefly, what is glass? I mean, glass is of course a solid, but it is a non-crystalline solid. And we prepare glasses by starting with their melts, and we rapidly cool these melts. Very rapid cooling of the melt is done. That means you don't allow the glass to the glass melt to solidify slowly, but suddenly you solidify it. Suddenly you remove the heat energy from the melt. So this is a very well-known diagram between volume versus temperature. Temperature along x-axis, volume along the y-axis, and you start with some liquid like molten silicon dioxide or molten B2O3. And for example, the melting point of silicon dioxide is around 1400 or 1500 degrees Celsius. So if you cool your silicon dioxide melt very slowly you cool it, maybe at a rate of 1 degree Celsius per hour, very slowly. Then at some particular temperature, which is known as the melting temperature or freezing temperature, the volume will decrease abruptly. Abrupt change in volume you will see, and you get a crystalline phase. But supposing I remove heat energy, the enthalpy, the heat content of the liquid very rapidly, very suddenly, then this abrupt decrease in volume you will not see, but you will see a continuous decrease in volume. Volume will decrease. Most of the materials, they shrink when you cool them, and it will enter what is known as the supercooled liquid region. Here it is still a liquid, but it is much more colder than a liquid because I have removed heat from it. And then it goes a continuous transition, and this is known as a glass transition range or glass transformation range. And we get a solid which has very high viscosity of the order of 10 raised to power 22 poise, and it is also rigid like a crystal. So we can have a fast cooled glass, we can also have a slow cooled glass. And when you do this rapid cooling of the melt, the structure of the final glass is a solid, liquid is something which can flow. The structure of the final glass is very similar to the structure of liquid, and they both have disordered atomic arrangement, disordered arrangement of the atoms. Whereas in a crystal, when you cool the liquid very slowly, you get crystalline phase below the melting temperature. And whether you do fast cooling after that or slow cooling after the melting temperature or freezing temperature, you get the same phase. And glasses, they show this glass transition phenomena in which they enter the supercooled liquid region when they are heated. Now, if you start from the glassy phase and begin heating it, you will first see a supercooled liquid region, and then finally above the liquidus temperature, you will see the liquid. So glasses can be prepared either by rapid cooling of the melt or by heavy ion irradiation or by neutron bombardment. And some materials like ice, it can also form glasses by applying pressure. This is known as the pressure induced amorphization. So remember, glass is crystalline. It is not having any regular arrangement of atoms. So if you do X-ray diffraction or a neutron diffraction study of a glass, you will not see sharp peaks because Bragg's law is not applicable. Bragg's condition cannot be satisfied. You will see only broad humps due to the short range order, and glasses are not in the lowest energy state. So they are non-equilibrium. They are having enthalpy which is higher than the enthalpy of the corresponding crystalline phase at the same temperature. And they are also non-ergodic. You know the principle of ergodicity. You have studied in statistical mechanics, and it is the fundamental principle of equilibrium statistical mechanics, which states that the ensemble is the collection of mental copies of the system, and the ensemble average is same as the time average. So in complicated systems, which is having very large number of particles, we apply statistical mechanics, and the time average we cannot measure because we cannot monitor the position and the momentum coordinates of all the Avogadro number of particles in a system. So instead, we study a collection of mental copies of the system, which we call as the ensemble. And the fundamental principle of statistical mechanics is that the ensemble average is same or it is equal to the time average. And that is the principle of ergodicity. But glasses, they have a relaxation time of the order of cosmological time periods. That means their time scales of relaxation is very, very large, of the order of billions of years, if not millions of years. So you cannot do any experiment over a period of millions of years. So the ergodicity principle breaks down in case of glasses. So glass is non-crystalline. This is a diagram which illustrates the structure of a crystalline silica on the left-hand side. Crystalline silica is silicon dioxide, but it is quartz. And this is the structure of amorphous silica. Amorphous silica is also silicon dioxide. So composition is same. So those silicon atoms they are marked, they are shown in yellow color, light brown color, and the oxygen atoms, they are shown in black color. So each silicon atom is bonded through to 4 oxygen atoms. But here you see only 3 oxygen atoms because the 4th oxygen atom is out of the plane. It is along the perpendicular axis, perpendicular to the plane of this blackboard or the computer screen. So the coordination number of silicon with oxygen, coordination number means the number of nearest neighbors. How many are the numbers of neighbors for each silicon atom? The coordination number is 4 for silicon in the amorphous form as well as in the crystalline form. But here you see the bond angles. The bond angles are variable. The bond angles can change, but here all the oxygen, silicon, oxygen bond angles are same. So bond angles will be a delta function, mathematically speaking, but here it will be a broad function. It will show a distribution. So how to prepare glasses? You can start with your oxide materials. Mortar pestle you need to just mix the starting materials. And this is the platinum crucible, which shows the melt. And we put these materials in a furnace. We melt them at a temperature of say around 100 degrees, about 1000 degrees Celsius. If these are silicate glasses, you may need 1500 degrees Celsius or 1400 degrees Celsius. And then we pour the melt and we get these glass pieces. So glass made out of oxide materials like silica, B2O3, tellurium dioxide, P2O5, germania. Germania is germanium dioxide. Those glasses are transparent. And here we show the pictures of some telluride glasses, and they are also transparent. So tellurium dioxide is a conditional glass former, and it forms glasses with difficulty when it is present in the pure form. And we need very high quenching rates. Quenching means rapid cooling. Rapid cooling of the melt. We need quenching rates of the order of 10 raised to power 5 Kelvin per second to get pure TiO2 glass. And the structure means the atomic arrangement. I mean, what are the bond lengths? What are the coordination numbers? What are the bond angle distributions? Because there will be a distribution of bond angles. Because glass is not regular, there is no unit cell, so there is no regular periodic arrangement of atoms. So the structure of pure TiO2 glass prepared by roller quenching method was first published in 2013 by Barney, by a group in United Kingdom, and Goulenko, a group in France. And they found that on average, the tellurium oxidant coordination number is 3.68 by neutron diffraction studies. And later on, about 3 years later, in 2017, a group in Greece, led by Professor Kamit Sos, they prepared bulk tellurium dioxide glass also by a special cooling and heating method, intermittent cooling technique. So why we prefer the telluride glasses for phosphors? Because of the high polarizability of tellurium ions. Polarizability means the extent to which you can deform the electronic distribution around an atom or an ion. And they are highly transparent in the visible region. We would like to have a phosphor which is transparent to light, so that the light emitted can come out. They have high refractive index, about 2, and phonon energy. The phonons are a hindrance. They are something undesirable in the phenomena of fluorescence because they give rise to non-radiative transitions. We would like to minimize them. So their phonon energies are, their phonon bands are only up to 800 centimeter inverse. Above that, there are no phonon bands. And they have very good linear and non-linear optical applications. They can show second harmonic and third harmonic generation. So the structure, what is the structure of a glass? Does glasses have a structure? Of course, they have a structure. For any glassy material, there is a definite structure. But there can occur small modifications in the structure of glass if you modify the methods of preparation. And the short range, the glasses, they have only short range order because there is no regular long range arrangement of the atoms. And the structure of the telluride glass, it consists of these TeO4 units. TeO4 units, they have each tellurium atom is bonded to 4 oxidants, and the tellurium ion, the tellurium atoms, they also have a lone pair of electrons. So these electrons, which are not bounded, they are not chemically bonded to any atom, to any oxidant atom. They give rise to very large polarization of the material. And when you add some network modifiers like alkali ions or calcium ions or tungsten ions or silver ions or cupric ions, then these TiO4 units if you add these network modifier ions, which are known as the network modifiers or intermediates, then what happens is that one of the tellurium oxygen bond length, it increases. So instead of TiO4, we now get TiO3 plus 1 unit. So bond length, it increases from say about 2.1 to about from 1.9, it may become 2.2 angstrom. So these are known as the axial bonds, and these longer tellurium oxygen bond can completely break, and you can get TiO3 units. So this is the structural modification which takes place when you add metal oxides like alkali oxides or alkaline oxides in your tellurium dioxide. We generally prepare telluride glasses. In fact, we always prepare telluride glasses by adding some network modifiers, because tellurium dioxide has very poor glass forming ability. By itself, it forms glasses with difficulty. And some very interesting effects are seen when you add some metal oxides like strontium oxide or lead oxide in the tellurium dioxide. You get glassy phase. These are the photographs of some of the lead telluride and strontium telluride samples prepared by quenching method. These photographs are for the samples of strontium telluride and lead telluride. And we see mostly a smooth background, but in some regions, we see these crystal-like things. Some inclusions are there, and these inclusions, they have a definite morphology also. You can see this in this last photograph, and these are the pictures taken under a microscope, an optical microscope. And these inclusions are not crystals, but they are disordered crystals, which are known as anti-glass phases. So similar effect we have found in bismuth niobium telluride system. Again, you see inclusions in a glass matrix. There is some inclusion, and so some two different phases are existing simultaneously in your system. You can see some of these papers published in 2018 and 19, and also 20 and 21. And these are the another system, strontium telluride, is having 10 mole% of strontium oxide and 90 mole% of tellurium dioxide. So these are also transparent glass ceramics. And we see a smooth matrix. That smooth matrix is of the glassy phase. And in that matrix, we have these inclusions. And these are very big inclusions. The size of these inclusions is about 100 microns. In this strontium telluride system. So what is an anti-glass phase? This is the question which will naturally come. What is an anti-glass? It is a solid phase which has long-range order of cations like tellurium, bismuth, niobium, strontium. These ions are arranged in some definite positions. But of course, there is an interchange between the strontium ions and tellurium ions. That means they are occupying each other's position. But the oxide ions, they are arranged randomly. So there is a long range order of cations, but the anions, which are the oxide ions, they are arranged randomly. So there is a vibrational disorder in these materials, vibrational disorder which is similar to that which exists in glasses. So if you do an X-ray diffraction study of an anti-glass, you will see sharp peaks. Whereas if you do the Raman studies or infrared studies on these materials, because they have a vibrational disorder, the phonons cannot propagate long distances. They show very broad bands, broad Raman and FTIR bands, which are very similar to those from glasses. Whereas the crystalline materials, they show sharp peaks in both X-ray diffraction studies as well as in the spectroscopic studies like Raman studies. So an anti-glass is something which is intermediate to the glassy phase and the ordered crystalline phase. So it is neither a glassy phase nor a crystalline phase. So it is an anti-glass. So it has some features which are opposite to those of glasses, because there is a cationic long range order, whereas in glasses there is a cationic long range, there is a cationic disorder. So if you study the Raman study, if you do the Raman spectroscopy of this sample like bismuth telluride, it forms an anti-glass phase. Its X-ray diffraction pattern shows sharp peaks, which is characteristic of a crystalline phase. But the Raman bands are fairly broad. You can see these Raman bands around 650 centimeter inverse and around 750 centimeter inverse. And these are due to TO4 and TO3 units. So Raman is showing disorder, vibrational disorder. The phonons, they cannot propagate long distances, but the XRD patterns, they show ordered arrangement, and the ordered arrangement is only that of the cations, like bismuth and tellurium ions in this case. So we functionalize these materials with erbium oxide. You add some small amount of erbium oxide in bismuth niobium telluride, and you get a glass ceramic. And it's a glass ceramic because it has both the glassy phase and the anti-glass phase, which is coexisting. And we excite it with the IR light, 980 nanometer, which is generated by a diode laser. So 980 nanometer, it lies in the IR region, near infrared region. And what you see, you can see this picture. The sample was actually yellow in color, but here the color of the sample is green. You can see this photograph where I am pointing the arrow. So you see green light coming out of the sample because the erbium ions, they show upconversion by a method, by a process which is known as ESA, excited state absorption. Two photons of 980 nanometer inverse, they are absorbed and they take the erbium ions from one excited state to the next higher excited state. And then we see the green light emission, which is due to the emission of green light at 553 nanometer green light emission. So we are having transition from S state to the I state. And we have also done micro photoluminescence spectroscopy, where we study the luminescence yield from the inclusions. You can see this picture. We can see this droplet phase and also the matrix phase. So the intensity of the photoluminescence is same from the matrix, which is glassy, and the inclusion, which is an anti-glass. And this gives you the distribution of the erbium ions and the tellurium ions and bismuth ions along a line. So we take a line scan, and the distribution of the concentration of the tellurium, erbium, and bismuth is same everywhere. So the matrix and the inclusion phase, they are of the same composition, but their structures are very same. And their photoluminescence intensities are also found to be same within the limits of experimental uncertainty. So this is the process of upconversion, which is very useful for this green light generation. And this green light generation is very important. This erbium ions are extremely important in erbium doped fiber amplifiers, which are used for optical communications. You know, these days, our telecommunications are being done using light signals, using infrared light. So we use erbium doped fiber amplifiers for boosting the signal. This is another sample of europium oxide. Very small amount of europium oxide concentration is introduced in strontium telluride glass ceramic. and you see a very strong light emission at around 620 nanometer, 619.8 nanometer, and the excitation wavelength is 375 nanometer near UV light, and you see red light emission. The sample was actually yellowish in color, but it is emitting a red light because of fluorescence from the europium ions. Again, we add erbium oxide in lead telluride glass ceramic, and we see again up conversion, and the emission wavelength is the excitation wavelength is 980 nanometers, and we see green light emission of wavelength 553 nanometers. And the inclusions and the matrix, their photoluminescence intensities are also same. And on the right hand side, you see the Raman spectra, micro Raman spectra of erbium doped lead telluride samples. And we record the Raman pattern at the matrix phase, and also the Raman pattern at the inclusion phase, which is shown by these dots in the photograph shown in the inset. This red dot is the 0.2, and we record the Raman pattern at both the locations. And more or less, the Raman pattern is, the Raman signal is same, and also the bands are broad, although the inclusions, they have some, they have a long range arrangement of cations, but the Raman bands are broad because of the vibrational disorder. So similarly, we have prepared europium doped lithium telluride glasses. Lithium telluride glasses have been reported to show fluorescence even in the absence of the rare earth ions. And you can prepare these glasses very easily at low melting temperatures of about 650 or 700 degrees Celsius. You can see the XRD patterns on the left-hand side, broad bands, because the samples are amorphous. If you increase, we add europium ions at the expense of lithium ions. So when you increase the europium oxide concentration from 1 to 5 mole%, the density increases, and you can see the glass density, it increases. The glass density is shown in the black dots, and the molar volume also increases. So when you add europium ions in the structure, the glass network is expanding. So that is in a way beneficial, because it will prevent the segregation of europium ions, because if segregation takes place, then the probability of non-radiative transitions increases. So these are the thermal scans or the DSC patterns of the glasses. We see a glass transition at 265 degrees Celsius. These DSC spectra are recorded on a these thermal spectra, the thermal analysis done on a Sataram DSC system. This is for a lithium telluride sample with 20 mole% of lithium oxide, and this is for a lithium telluride sample with 25 mole%. And when you add europium ions from 1 to 2, 3, 4, 5, the glass transition temperature, it shifts towards higher temperature. So the network is becoming stronger. The glass transition temperature increases when you add europium ions in the structure. That is expected because the europium oxidant bonding is very strong, much more stronger. The bond enthalpy of europium oxidant is larger than that of the tellurium oxidant bonding. And these are the Raman patterns in the low wave number region from 30 to 900 centimeter inverse. And these are also the Raman patterns in the higher wave number regions for europium doped samples. For lithium telluride samples, we don't see any peak around 1370 centimeter inverse. Actually, these are not Raman bands, but these are photoluminescence peaks, which arises when you excite your europium doped lithium telluride sample. And these are the PL intensity curves. We can see very strong, very intense. The counts are almost 6 million counts, and there is no quenching effects. There are no concentration quenching effects. When you increase the europium oxide concentration, because the glass network is expanding, the distance between the europium ions is increasing, although their concentration is also increasing. And the intensity of the photoluminescence yield, it increases with an increase in europium oxide concentration. And you can see these samples of europium lithium telluride samples. They are placed in some poly bags, and we expose these poly bags to UV light of wavelength. We expose it to near UV light of wavelength 350 nanometers. And what you see is this strong red color, very strong red light is seen when you expose it to UV, near UV light. And these are again the photoluminescence peaks. And from the Raman studies also, you can do photoluminescence spectroscopic studies within a certain limited wavelength range. Similarly, erbium doped lithium telluride samples, we dope erbium oxide from 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 mole%. The glass transition temperature increases with the increase in erbium oxide concentration. And the network, you can see the glass transition temperature, it increases from 265 to 298 Kelvin on adding 5 mole% of erbium oxide. And you can see these Raman bands. And there is not much significant change in the short range structure. And you see these bands in the higher Raman shift range. These are not Raman bands, but these are photoluminescence peaks. And here we see a very interesting effect. These high frequency Raman bands from 900 to about 1200 centimeter inverse, they completely suppress when you increase the concentration of erbium oxide concentration. So these are the concentration quenching effects which we see in the erbium doped samples, but we don't see them in europium doped samples. And these are again the PL curves in the figure 7. And you see as you increase the erbium oxide concentration, the PL intensity of light emitted around 500 nanometer, it decreases. So erbium doped samples, when they are excited with 350 nanometer, here we are using 380 nanometer, they emit green light of wavelength 555 nanometers. So these are the color chromaticity diagrams. So we can see the points, they lie in the green region of the chromaticity diagram. So they are green light emitters. So this is again the phenomena of down conversion. We are converting a short wavelength photon into a longer wavelength photon. So near UV light is converted into visible light, and that lies in the green region. So this is the picture of the structure. When the concentration of erbium is low, they are occupying these voids in the glass network. But when the concentration is very high, they fill up the voids, and there are very large number of erbium ions near to each other in a small localized region. So that increases the probability of non-radiative transitions, and that is why you see concentration quenching effects. And we can also calculate the color purity of the sample. That means how pure is the color emitted by a sample. If it is a monochromatic light source, it will emit light of only one color, and its color purity will be 100%. But if it is a white light source, that means it is emitting blue light, green, and red light with equal proportions, then its color purity will be 0. So for an ideal white light source, the coordinates are 0.33, 0.33. So it will be here in this part of the CI diagram. But if it is a 100% colored light emitting source, then it will lie at the boundary near one of these edges. We have prepared some bismuth, niobium telluride glasses and anti-glass ceramics, and we dope them with these are the ESC patterns for rare earth doped bismuth telluride samples, and we measure the glass transition temperature. So the glass transition temperature is in the range of 371 to 391 degrees Celsius. And when you add rare earth ions like dysprosium, gadolinium, yttrium, europium, then the glass transition temperature increases. And again, we see these inclusions, but the inclusions are of the smaller size, about 20 microns. You can recall that in strontium telluride systems, the size of the inclusions was almost 700 microns. That means close to 1 millimeters. And you could see some of the inclusions even with a naked eye in case of strontium tellurides. But here the size of the inclusions is small. If you add B2O3, which is a very good glass former, the inclusions disappear and we see only glassy phase, the formation of the glassy phase. So we record their UV visible spectra to see where the absorption bands takes place. And we should excite your sample near these absorption edges when you are doing photoluminescence spectroscopy. Is around 400 nanometers for almost all the samples. So below 400 nanometers, the absorption will be very high. So typically we would like to expose your sample to these wavelengths where the absorption is high. And the sample should emit light where its absorption is less. So that is of course true in case of europium and erbium doped samples. This is the PL spectra of europium doped bismuth niobium telluride glass ceramic. And we see very strong emission in the red part of the electromagnetic spectrum, and very little light is emitted below 500 nanometers inverse. So its chromaticity diagram is in the chromaticity diagram. The coordinates they are around, the x coordinates are around 0.6 and the y coordinates are around 0.4. So these are very strong red emitters. So if you want red phosphors, europium is the candidate. So we can convert infrared to visible light by doping with erbium. You shine 980 nanometer inverse, and what light is emitted is green light. So we convert the longer wavelength light to shorter wavelength light by this process, excited state absorption. The two photons are involved. One photon takes the erbium ion from the level 1 to 2, and then another photon of the same energy takes the erbium ion from level 2 to 3. And then the erbium ions, they come to the lower energy levels, and in that process they emit green light. So this is the process of this is the process of excited state absorption occurring in upconversion involving erbium ions. Raman spectroscopy, I've already discussed some of the patterns. These are the Raman bands. In this diagram, the Raman bands around 650 and 750 are due to the vibrational modes of tellurium oxidant bonds, whereas these bands from 900 to about 1300 centimeter inverse, these are the photoluminescence peaks of erbium ions. These are not the Raman bands. We can dope the rare earth ions like erbium in barium telluride materials, glasses, barium telluride and barium borotelluride glasses. So rare earth ions are needed to cause fluorescence in the telluride materials. And these are the optical absorption spectra, the three patterns at the bottom. And these are the DSC patterns for erbium doped barium telluride samples. And again, erbium doped samples, they emit green light, whereas the europium doped samples, they emit red light. So these are some of the spectroscopic data. You can see the XY coordinates. And again, in case of barium telluride system, if you increase the europium oxide concentration, we don't see any concentration quenching effects. Even at a 7 mole%, you see very strong luminescence, and the luminescence intensity at 7 mole% is higher as compared to the luminescence intensity of 1 mole% sample. These are for the dysprosium doped samples, and they emit yellow light, and the maximum intensity of photoluminescence is around 580 nanometers. So that is yellow light. So dysprosium doped samples in barium borotelluride system is a yellow light emitter. And if you add erbium ions, the erbium ions, they emit in the green region. And here again, you see that as you increase the erbium oxide concentration from 1 to 7 mole%, the luminescence intensity falls. So we see that for europium and for dysprosium, there are no concentration quenching effects in telluride systems. But for erbium, very strong concentration quenching effects are seen due to non-radiative transitions. We can determine the short range structure by Raman and by FTIR spectroscopy. We can see how the coordination number of tellurium with oxygen changes when you increase the metal oxide concentration by measuring the relative intensities of the Raman band at 650 and 750 centimeter inverse. Strontium telluride is a very good material for hosting the europium ions. And this is some of our other papers, other work. We are adding 1 mole% of europium oxide in a strontium telluride system, and very strong luminescence in the red part of the electromagnetic spectrum is seen. So here the points, they lie in the red part of the chromaticity diagram. Lanthanum tellurides, they also form glass and anti-glass phases, and they form glass ceramics, and you can introduce large concentration of rare earth ions in the lanthanum telluride system. And some of the lanthanum tellurides, like the lanthanum telluride doped with gadolinium and lanthanum telluride doped with ytterbium, they are white light sources. So very good white light emission is seen. So you see the emission of blue light, green and red light from the samples containing ytterbium. And of course, the erbium doped samples, they emit mostly in the green part of the electromagnetic spectrum. These are some of the PL curves for the dysprosium doped sample. This is for ytterbium lanthanum telluride sample. So in the second part, I come to the crystalline oxides, which can be used for phosphors. So far, we have been discussing the glasses. Glasses are non-crystalline materials, and they are metastable materials. If you heat a glass above its glassization temperature, it will crystallize. Whereas the crystalline materials are stable. They are stable up to 1000 degrees Celsius. But the glasses, they are not stable. If you heat a glass, it will crystallize or it will gradually melt. So you can prepare phosphors using molybdates, tungstates, aluminates, vanadates, zirconates, borates, phosphates, silicates, and so on. For example, these are some of the LEDs, light emitting diodes, which have been doped, which are made out of phosphors. You know, an ordinary LED is made out of a semiconductor, and when you forward bias it, it emits light because of the recombination of electrons and holes. And it can be a blue light LED, yellow light LED, it can be a red light LED. Larger the band gap of a material or semiconductor, more is the frequency of light emitted by it. And here you can see an LED made out of a phosphor. Here also there is an LED, but that LED emits UV light, 250 nanometers or 300 nanometers, light which you cannot see. But inside this LED, there is a crystal of phosphor. That phosphor material absorbs UV light and it emits red light, or it can emit white light also. And it can also emit green light if it is having terbium. If it is having dysprosium, it will emit white light. If it is having europium doped phosphor, it will emit red light. So these white light LEDs, WLEDs, nowadays they are very popular. We don't use fluorescent lamps or incandescent bulbs, but we use white light LEDs in our homes and offices. Their cost of operation, the electricity that they consume, is much less. So we have prepared erbium doped calcium molybdate. How we prepare them? Very simple. You take sodium molybdate and calcium carbonate. Sodium molybdate is a powder. Solid calcium carbonate is also a powder. You mix them in this appropriate molar ratio, and carbon dioxide will go out, and you will get calcium molybdate. This is the solid state method. You can also prepare them by using some chemical methods. You dissolve sodium molybdate in water and you add some calcium chloride. You will get calcium molybdate and sodium chloride. Sodium chloride is soluble in water, whereas calcium molybdate is insoluble. So you can do filtration and you will get precipitates of calcium molybdate, and after that you can heat it. And on heating, you will get pure, almost pure calcium molybdate. This calcium molybdate and also sodium molybdate, these are very good phosphor materials, and they show phosphorescence even in the absence of the rare earth ions. Calcium molybdate is a tetragonal crystal structure. So we did synchrotron X-ray diffraction, very high resolution powder X-ray diffraction studies were done at the Raja Ramanna Center for Advanced Technology. These are some of the XRD patterns. So the counts are very high and the resolution of the instrument is very large, very high resolution. So you can do very accurate Rictveld analysis. When you do Rictveld analysis, you can find the structure of a material. You can find what is the space group to which it belongs, whether it is tetragonal. And of course, calcium tungstate and calcium molybdate, they are both tetragonal unit cells. A is equal to B, and that is not equal to C. And all the angles are 90 degrees. And from the synchrotron X-ray diffraction studies, we found that the two phases, they exist separately. The erbium oxide and the calcium molybdate peaks, you can separately identify from the X-ray diffraction patterns, and you can find the lattice parameters. You can find the position of the calcium ions, molybdenum ions, and oxide ions, and also the erbium ions. So the erbium ions, they exist in the octahedral geometry. Each erbium ion is surrounded by 6 oxygen ions. Molybdenum has tetrahedral, whereas each calcium ion is surrounded by 8 oxygen ions. So you can do modeling of the structure of the material, and the molybdenum oxygen bond length is 1.8 angstrom, and calcium oxygen bond length is in this range of 2.42 to 2.47 angstrom. And we study the luminescence. Here again we see concentration quenching effects. As you increase the erbium oxide concentration, the first from 1 to about 3 mole%. Sorry, here we again see strong concentration quenching effects. As you increase the erbium oxide concentration, the luminescence intensity falls. So we see green light emission when you excite it with 320 nanometer and 380 nanometer. These lie in the UV region. So erbium doped samples, they are good green light emitters. So it is showing down conversion. We are converting UV light to visible light. And we do energy dispersive X-ray analysis to see the surface morphology, and also to measure the concentration of calcium, tungsten, oxygen, europium, and dysprosium ions in the lattice. And the concentration is fairly uniform. So there is no segregation, there is no clustering of the ions, the rare earth ions in the structure. And we also, these are the again the X-ray diffraction patterns, and very high resolution XRD studies were done, using a very strong X-ray source of wavelength 0.78681 angstrom. So it is a purely monochromatic X-ray source, unlike a laboratory X-ray source, where you use a copper tube that has both copper K alpha lines and copper K alpha 2 lines. These are the rich-filled refinements of calcium tungstate doped with europium oxide and dysprosium oxide. The XRD patterns, they confirm that europium ions and the dysprosium ions, they do not replace the calcium ions in the structure, but europium oxide and dysprosium oxide phases, they exist separately. We did neutron diffraction studies, because if you want to study the position of the oxygen ions in the structure, then we need neutron beams, because X-rays, they do not see the light elements like oxidants. And the neutron diffraction studies also confirm that the two phases of calcium tungstate and dysprosium oxide and the rare earth oxide, they occur separately. These are the pair correlation functions which are calculated from the neutron diffraction patterns. You see the first peak around 1.71 angstrom. These are the W oxygen bonds, and a second very strong peak around 2.84 angstrom. And these are the oxygen correlations which were missing in the X-ray diffraction studies. Raman studies also confirm the formation of the existence of two phases, distinct phases of rare earth oxide and the calcium tungstate. And all these Raman bands are due to the W oxygen vibrational modes, either the stretching modes or the bending modes. And here again we see that as you increase the dysprosium concentration in your calcium tungstate matrix, the photoluminescence intensity falls. This is a result which is different from that is observed in glasses. In glasses, we don't see concentration quenching effects with dysprosium ions and europium ions. But in crystalline materials, we are seeing those concentration quenching effects. The photoluminescence intensity falls with the increase in the rare earth oxide concentration. And there are also the effects of annealing temperature on the polycrystalline samples. If you increase the annealing temperature to 1150 degrees Celsius from 800 degrees Celsius, your photoluminescence intensity increases significantly. And this work is also published. So you can see this paper, and we have doped the materials with calcium with europium, dysprosium, samarium, europium. And you can see that some of the europium doped samples, they lie in this region, whereas the co-doped samples containing europium and dysprosium, they lie in the center, which are in the white region of the luminescence. So if you want white light sources, we can use calcium tungstate, which is co-doped with the europium and dysprosium ions. We have also prepared their thin films because for device miniaturization, we would like to have their thin films. So we prepare thin films of calcium molybdate and calcium tungstate by pulsed laser deposition. And the cross-sectional STEM studies show that the thickness of the film is around 103 nanometer, about 100 nanometers. And there is a fairly uniform distribution of calcium, tungsten, europium, and dysprosium ions in the film. And you can see this granular surface morphology of the calcium molybdate film. This is the cross-sectional view in the photograph B. Thickness is 122 nanometer, and here the magnification is around 100 nanometers. So you can see these grains of the size of about 80 to 90 nanometers. We do GIXRD studies. This work is also published this year in Journal of Vacuum Science and Technology. And you see very strong peaks due to calcium tungstate, the same tetragonal phase. And these are the Raman patterns. Raman patterns are very similar to those of the powder samples. So the same phase is formed by PLD deposition. So that is the advantage of pulsed laser deposition. It gives you a very good stoichiometry, which you cannot get by sputtering or by electron beam deposition techniques. And very strong photoluminescence is seen in these doped samples, erbium doped, europium doped, and erbium and dysprosium doped samples. So you can measure the quantum yield. That means the efficiency of luminescence. What is the percentage of light emitted to the total light incident on the sample that can be measured or determined from quantum yield studies. We have prepared some of the aluminate samples, molybdates and tungstates. They are thermally not stable above 1200 degrees Celsius. And tungstates and molybdates are also more expensive. So we prepare the aluminates, calcium aluminate, which is also a material used in cement, and strontium aluminate. The starting materials are calcium carbonate and aluminum oxide. And you sinter it to a temperature of about 1400 degrees Celsius. And we get mostly the monoclinic calcium CaAl2O4 phase, and a very small concentration of CaAl4O7 phase is also seen, and that we confirm by X-ray diffraction measurements. And we do ritual analysis. So we see the formation of the monoclinic phase. A is not equal to B is not equal to C. Alpha and gamma, they are 90 degrees. And that is not equal to beta, that is slightly deviating from the angle of 90 degree. So these are the structural parameters, the unit cell dimensions. And almost 95% of the phase is CaAl2O4. The other phase is very small, about 5%. So we get a single phase material by simple solid state sintering method. This is the structure. This shows the unit cell, the monoclinic unit cell, and the short range structural units. ALO4, that means the aluminum ions, they exist in tetrahedral coordination, and the coordination number of calcium is either 6 or it is 9. So once you do ritual analysis, you can model the structure of a material by giving in your unit cell and the atomic position coordinates in some softwares like Vesta. And these are the Raman patterns which show the aluminum oxidant vibration bands. And when you add the rare earth oxides, the Raman signal is greatly enhanced. So you see much more stronger Raman patterns in rare earth doped samples. We see this luminescence spectra. Europium lobe samples, they emit red light. Samarium also emits red light. Dysprosium emits both green light as well as blue light, 471 as well as 568 nanometers. So it is a white light emitter. Dysprosium doped samples, they are white light emitters. And erbium doped samples, they are green light emitters. You can see maximum intensity around 547 nanometers. And as a comparison of calcium aluminate and strontium aluminate, we find that the calcium aluminates are very good materials as compared to the strontium aluminates for photoluminescence applications. Their luminescence intensity is almost 100 times greater than the strontium aluminates. You can see these graphs. Black lines, they represent the luminescence intensity for calcium aluminate containing 1 mole% of europium oxide. And red is here, very small, almost 100 times more intense. So calcium aluminates, they are very good materials for red light and white light sources, and they are very cheap materials. You can prepare them using very low cost materials like aluminum oxide and calcium carbonate. If you bombard these samples with the electron beams, then I can reduce europium 3 plus to europium 2 plus, and then it shows blue light emission. We are very interested in blue light emitters because the phosphors which are emitting in the blue region, they are more scarce, they are more difficult to prepare. So I can convert europium 3 plus to europium 2 plus, and I see blue light emission due to the electronic transitions of EU2 plus ions. So here you see the exciting wavelength is 350 nanometers, and the electron irradiated sample, it emits light mostly at 442 nanometers. Broad band is seen, and the light emitted in the red part is much less, almost 10 to 20 times less. So it is a blue light source. Some of the band-aids, these are the last few slides. We have prepared barium band-aids. And barium band-aids are very outstanding materials for luminescence applications because they show light emission even in the absence of the rare earth ions. We have prepared these magnesium band-aids, calcium, strontium, and zinc band-aids. And all these band-aids are having triclinic structure, except a zinc band-aid, which is monoclinic. And we show some of these are also semiconducting materials, and their DC conductivity is of the order of 10, their DC resistance is of the order of 10 raised to power 8 ohms at room temperature. And if you increase the temperature, resistance falls drastically. These are the impedance or the LCR measurements, and their dielectric constants are also fairly high, around 180 at frequency of about 1 kilohertz. And these are the Raman patterns of band-aids. The vibrational bands are mostly due to vanadium oxygen stretching and bending vibration modes. And we see very good green light emission from these band-aids. You can see this is the excitation spectra, and this is the photoluminescence spectra shown on the right. We see very strong, very intense, although it is a broad band, around 520 nanometers. So I can convert blue light into green light. So these are the visual images of the barium band-aid and samarium barium band-aid samples under ordinary light, your daylight or the ordinary light, and we see this greenish tinge under visible light of a room. But if you expose it to a UV lamp of wavelength, say 250 nanometers or 350 nanometers, you see very strong green light emission. and their quantum yield values are in the range of 6 to 8%. So once you have designed these phosphors, how to use them in your white light LEDs. So your white light LEDs, they contain a UV light LED, ultraviolet LED, which is operated by a battery, a low voltage battery, and we have a housing made of a plastic, and that housing is coated with green phosphors, with red phosphors, and with blue phosphors. So when the photons are incident, the green phosphors will emit green light, red phosphors will emit red light, and the blue phosphors will emit blue light. And these three primary colors, they mix to give you white light. So this is how a white light LED is made using the phosphors. And phosphors can be your glasses. They can also be crystalline materials. So finally, I thank my PhD students, some of the present and former students who graduated during the last 2-3 years. Amarjot Kaur, Nupur Gupta, Hirdesh. Hirdesh is going to face his PhD viva tomorrow. And some of the lead telluride samples and lithium telluride samples were prepared by Hirdesh. Rajinder prepared these strontium telluride samples. And Amarjot and Nupur, they prepared barium telluride and bismuth niobium telluride samples. Puneet Kaur is preparing these vandates and aluminates. And Jatinder Kaur is doing work on thin films or mandates. And Navjot Kaur, Ravish Kumar Jain, Shruti, and Amandeep Kaur, who is now in Bathinda in teaching in a college. And I thank my collaborators, Dr. Krishna from BARC, Margit Fabian from the Budapest Neutron Center, and Anne Crystal Dippel from DESI. And also I forgot to mention Dr. M.N. Singh from Raja Ramanna Center for Advanced Technology in India, and our funding agencies DST, UGC, DA, CSR, Mumbai and Indore centers. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir, for this interesting talk, and it's really informative. Now it's time for the interaction session, and this talk is open for discussion. I invite questions from the audience.
Sir, it's a very nice talk, informative talk, sir. Can you hear me, sir?
Yes, sir. Please continue.
Sir, yes, sir. You have mentioned this. You are measuring the quantum yield. Actually, sir, how you are measuring experimentally?
Yeah, we use an integrated sphere, which is coated from inside with barium sulfate. So it is a spherical structure which is coated with barium sulfate from inside. Barium sulfate is used because it does not absorb UV light and it is transparent in the wide wavelength range. So we put the sample in this integrating sphere and we excite the sample and we measure the incident light intensity and the emitted light intensity. So from the areas under the curves, we can find the quantum yield because that is basically the ratio of the counts in the emission spectra to the counts in the excitation spectra.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Okay, sir. Sir, there's a very small question. Another question, sir.
Yes.
What is the basic difference of fluorescence and phosphorescence, sir?
Phosphorescence and fluorescence, the difference lies mostly in the decay time. Phosphorescence is a slower process. So the decay can continue for seconds or hours or even for days. Whereas fluorescence is a more rapid phenomena in which the decay takes place in a time less than 10⁻⁵ seconds.
Sir, in phosphorescence, do you need a intermediate state?
Yeah, you need some states which are long-lived. So when the ion enters that state, it should be there for a long time. You need some metastable, long-lived
states. Yes, sir. Okay, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Sir, good afternoon.
Yes, good afternoon.
Sir, my question is, that these material glass ceramics which you have made from erbium and strontium that have the variable optical properties. In addition to that, it has a good dielectric constant. So can it be used for insulating material for our electrical equipments?
Yeah, I mean, these glasses, they are highly insulating.
Highly
and,
insulating.
they are highly insulating. They are not conducting. So
Definitely,
their
because of the
dielectric
dielectric constant, high dielectric constant, this can be treated as a highly insulating material for electrical machines. So can the research and implementation can be done for the heavy electrical machines like 500 megawatt, 1000 megawatt, 1200 megawatt turbo generators? Can it be implemented over there for the insulation of the windings?
Yeah, some of the glasses, mostly silicates, borosilicates, they are used as isolators in your electrical systems.
GG.
And their dielectric, basically you will have to see the field strength also, how much electric field they can withstand
Definitely.
before it undergoes breakdown. So glasses, they are being used for isolation purposes.
ठीक है sir. Thank you. Shukriya.
Thank you.
So there is a question
sir,
from my side.
Hello.
Yeah. So please. I think Dr. Ajit Joshi is there.
Yes, Dr.
Yeah,
Ajit.
yes, sir, please continue.
Okay. Thank you, sir. May I audible now?
Yes, audible.
Hello.
Yeah, please continue. Ask your question.
Whatever limitations maximum from the F block, can we have some selected in the D blocks?
You mean the D block elements?
Elements, selective elements.
Some of the transition metal ions like chromium, they are also very good luminescent materials, and also copper ions. So we can, people are using D block elements like cupric ions, chromium ions, nickel ions also for luminescent materials.
Because these D block element are showing the electrical as well as magnetic property. So some any property will be conflict with this luminescence effect.
Yeah, I mean, I am not aware. I mean, whether the magnetic and the optical properties, they can show. I mean, we have to make the material and study. So D block elements are of course magnetic, but some of the D block elements like chromium ions, they are also being used as sensitizers, as activators in the fluorescent materials.
Okay, and now you are saying about the glasses material which is using calcium and calcium like that. So these are generally used in the cement industry.
Yes.
So can he also composite material used for that and luminescence for that?
Yeah, we have prepared calcium aluminate, which is a polycrystalline sample, CaAl2O4 phase we got by solid state sintering method. But calcium aluminate can also be prepared in the glassy form. People have prepared calcium aluminate glasses also. They need a temperature, melting temperature of around 1500 degrees Celsius. So calcium aluminate is being used in cement industry. And calcium aluminate we find in the polycrystalline form, the monoclinic structure, they are very good phosphor materials, good phosphorus. They are good host for rare earth ions.
Okay, sir. The last question, you are using the calcium carbonate, and you
Yes.
mentioned the temperature 300 to 400, 400 approximately something. The topic with this.
Calcium aluminate, calcium carbonate and aluminum oxide, they are mixed and they are first heated to about 800 degrees Celsius, and then we go up to 1400 degrees Celsius.
Yeah, that's why, because the calcium is converted to calcium oxide, then it will be reacted easily to the other compound.
Yes. So calcium carbonate has to first decompose, and that needs high temperature sintering above 1000 degrees Celsius.
Okay, thank you, sir. Thank you.
Sir, if you don't mind, I want to ask another question, sir.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Sir, in the Jablonski diagram, you have showed that there are lots of non-radiative transition.
Yes, yes.
So all these transitions will generate heat in the sample, sir, in the material.
Yeah, I mean,
that heat will be
we would like
considerable.
to avoid those non-radiative transitions because that will give rise to photons, not the photons.
Yes, sir.
So,
Yes, sir.
but they are always present. Some losses always take place. So
No,
if
sir,
you
that
go,
non-radiative. Sir, my question is, sir, that the non-radiative transition will generate heat in the sample
yes,
in my
it will be
device.
heat yes, but
That
the
is a
amount
huge
of
loss,
heat
no, sir?
generated is very small.
Okay, sir.
It will not, I mean, heat the sample. The temperature rise will
Okay,
be
thank you,
negligible.
sir. Okay, sir. Thank you. Thank you, sir. This is one of the best talks, sir. Thank
Okay,
you.
thank you.
Sir, I have another question. If
Yes.
you permit me, why we are using the phosphorus for that in coloring that in LED? Can we have other substitute other than phosphorus?
Yeah, in the white light LEDs, you are referring to white light LEDs?
No, sir. I am especially focused for the phosphorus. Why we are using phosphorus in
No, not
especially for?
phosphorus. Okay. Yeah,
Can we have other substitute?
element
Can we have
phosphorus.
other substance other than phosphorus?
Phosphorus is also used as a luminescent material in white light LEDs. Are you asking about phosphorus or phosphorus? So we need phosphorus, which should emit blue light, red, and green light.
I want to know the reason behind for that. Why we are selecting the phosphorus only, red, blue, and green? Why
Yeah,
not
because-
we have other than element other?
Okay. Because the red, blue, and green, they are primary colors. Once you mix those red, blue, and green, you will get white light. Red plus blue plus green, if they are mixed in the ratio 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, it gives you white light. They are the primary colors. Did I answer?
Yes, sir. Sir, can we have other elements in periodic table other than phosphorus, which can make same kind of intensity like that coloring changing in LED, other than phosphorus?
Yeah, I mean, there are variety of materials which are available, but you have to choose the phosphors which emit green, red, and blue light. All those three phosphors must be there.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Okay.
Yes, sir. If there is no other question, may I ask one question, sir?
Yes, sir, please.
Sir, actually, my question is simply silly question, but I wanted to know that if the crystalline phase can give the fluorescence, phosphorescence, sorry, then why we are going for the amorphous phase or the glassy phase?
Yeah.
So what are the advantages of this phase?
Okay. Yeah, there are advantages like ease of preparation. I mean, in the amorphous phase, you can have much wider composition range. You can form glasses over a wide composition range, and glasses are also naturally transparent, especially the oxide glasses. Whereas the polycrystalline samples, they are not transparent. They are opaque to light unless you prepare them in single crystal form. So if you prepare single crystal of calcium tungstate, that is transparent. If you prepare single crystal of calcium aluminate, that will also be transparent, but it is very difficult. And moreover, in the polycrystalline samples, if you add the dopant concentration beyond a particular limit, then segregation effects begin to take place. But in glasses, you have more flexibility to change the composition.
So what
And moreover, the oxide glasses are also naturally transparent.
So what technique you are exactly using? You said now as your starting slides that we have to reduce the temperature very fastly. Maybe something is like
yes.
rapid quenching.
Yes, yes, yes.
So what technique you are using for this rapid quenching, sir?
Okay, I will just show that slide again.
Yeah.
Let me share this. Is it? Can you
What's
see
the
that?
cooling rate? And the second question.
Yeah, actually the cooling rate is very slow. The Telluride glasses are very good glass formers. The cooling rate may be around 100 Kelvin per second. All you have to do is
Okay.
take out the crucible from the furnace and pour it on a metal block, and it will give you these glasses, bulk glasses. You don't have to splat quench them, so you can get big bulk glasses. What you can do is you can take a mold of graphite and pour the melt in the mold, and you will get bulk glasses, and you can polish them. So the quenching rate is about 100 Kelvin per second, few hundred kelvins per second.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, sir. Okay, got it.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you, sir. If there is any other question, the talk is still open for discussion.
So you can prepare Telluride glasses very easily. Very low quenching rates are needed. They are more difficult to crystalline but they are easier to prepare in the glassy phase. Different materials, they have different properties. Some materials, they form glassy phase very easily on cooling from the melt. Some materials form crystalline phase very easily on cooling from the melt. As a liquid metal hai, metal nu cool karoge, it will form crystalline phase unless you use very, very high quenching rate. But if you are having a silicate or a telluride melt and cool it, it will form glassy phase.
Actually, sir, I have some experience in working in metallic glasses.
Yes.
So there we usually keep the quenching rate at 10 to the power 6.
Yeah.
10 to the power 6. So it's extremely high Kelvin per second.
That's it.
So that's why I asked this question to you.
Yeah, they need very high quenching rate. You use melt spinning method.
Yeah, yes, sir. Yes, sir. You are very right. So, yeah.
On the behalf of Department of Physics, Maharaja Ranjit Singh Punjab Technical University, Bathinda, I, Supriya, PhD scholar, Department of Physics, MRS, PTU, Bathinda, would like to thank you, our expert, Dr. Atul Khanna, for such a wonderful and information session on glass and crystalline phosphorus for solid state lighting. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, madam. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thanks for sparing your time and thanks for interacting with our audience. Thanks a lot, sir.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Okay.
Dear participants, so this session is over for now. Now we will meet at 2:30 p.m. today after lunch. And the next speaker is Dr. M.B. Reddy, who will join sharply at 2:30. So I request all of you, please join at the time because I'm looking over the part list number of participants. The number of participants are joining after time, maybe after 15 minutes or 20 minutes. And I shall also request you, please interact with the speakers. The speakers are from different institutions and they are highly experienced persons. So we will definitely learn from them. So have a good day. Let's meet again at 2:30 on the same platform. Thank you very much. Have a nice day.
Thank you.